Hello, another day, one in which the unconventions of the new US diplomacy have been in evidence. Item 1, the President seems to have had an argument with the Australian Prime Minister and curtailed a phone conversation with him. 2, the National Security Advisor Michael Flynn has put Iran on notice, although no specification as to what that notice is of. And 3, it emerged that some days ago Donald Trump had suggested that he might send US troops into Mexico, telling the Mexican president that he needed to deal with the bad hombres down there. But all that being said, at the same time this evening in the UN, at the Security Council, the Americans have strongly condemned the Russians' actions in Ukraine and sounded very like they traditionally do.
We do want to better our relations with Russia. However, the dire situation in eastern Ukraine is one that demands clear and strong condemnation of Russian actions. The United States continues to condemn and call for an immediate end to the Russian occupation of Crimea. Crimea is a part of Ukraine. Our Crimea-related sanctions will remain in place until Russia returns control over the peninsula to Ukraine. There is a clear path to restoring peace in eastern Ukraine, full and immediate implementation of the Minsk agreements, which the United States continues to support.
US Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley there, sounding exactly like any US ambassador might. Now, perhaps it's confusing to Mr. Trump's opponents. He's destabilising. I suspect that for his supporters, there's craft in the chaos. The new president is unpredictable, and he's going to have everyone yielding to him. Here's our diplomatic editor, Mark Irvin.
The National Prayer Breakfast is a Washington institution, a chance for politicians, movers and shakers to commune with the Almighty. A chance also for President Trump to exhort them to keep the faith.
When you hear about the tough phone calls I'm having, don't worry about it. Just don't worry about it. They're tough. We have to be tough. It's time we're going to be a little tough, folks. We're taken advantage of by every nation in the world virtually. It's not going to happen anymore.
Tough calls.
Details leaked of a hostile phone conversation.
Try the one to Australia's Prime Minister at the weekend. A later tweet suggested the Australians needed to be pressured over a deal to resettle refugees in the US. So is the Twitter bully pulpit part of a rational strategy?
In the old days, let me say the old international regime was very careful about any tweet that would generate into tensions and conflicts. I mean, the entire planet now is on Twitter and on Facebook and social media. I think it's a good thing for the President of the United States to also be on social media.
But if this is the new liturgy of Washington, what to make of dissenters who undermine the message? Yesterday, National Security Advisor Mike Flynn gave Iran this warning.
President Trump has severely criticized the various agreements reached between Iran and the Obama administration, as well as the United Nations, as being weak and ineffective. Instead of being thankful to the United States in these agreements, Iran is now feeling emboldened. As of today, we are officially putting Iran on notice. Thank you.
But Pentagon people undermined that almost as soon as it went out, saying there was no change to their posture vis-à-vis Iran. It's very hard for outsiders to read.
With respect to Iran or North Korea, these are countries where honor matters a lot. And humiliating the leadership of countries like this in order to show that you've won a better deal is also a very good way to escalate into quite dangerous tensions.
Another feature of the Trump approach, seen with Pacific Trade or the EU, is to emphasize the bilateral or state-to-state approach rather than dealing with them as a group, in the hope of leveraging America's strength.
He's not going to dismantle historic alliances. He's trying to reform them, reorganize them. And to do so, he prefers. His method is to sit down with each one of these countries that formed these alliances, see what the bilateral situation is between the two countries on a variety of levels, and then talk about the forthcoming reform of these alliances.
There's been a great deal of disquiet within the State Department, and some people have leaked there too. So today, Rex Tillerson, taking up his position as Secretary of State, put the emphasis on pulling together.
Each of us is entitled to the expression of our political beliefs, but we cannot let our personal convictions overwhelm our ability to work as one team. Let us be understanding with each other about the times we live in as we focus our energies on our departmental goals.
Those in earnest supplication for a more moderate doctrine from men like Tillerson or General Mattis than from the ideologues close to Trump may, though, be deluding themselves.
In Mattis, you have a career military officer who has been trained up in the art of executing, right? I mean, someone who's lived his life in the military is not someone who's very familiar with how to counter orders coming down from above.
But we had tremendous success on The Apprentice.
Complicating any attempt to separate impulse or chaos from plan and policy are Trump's off-the-cuff remarks.
And they hired a big movie star, Arnold Schwarzenegger, to take my place. And we know how that turned out.
At this morning's prayer breakfast, he took a swipe at Arnold Schwarzenegger and his ratings on The Apprentice. With this administration, we've already learned to expect the unexpected.
I want to just pray for Arnold, if we can, for those ratings, okay?
Mark Urban there. Well, the new diplomacy is unpredictable, but it's also very much about the US taking on global affairs country by country. President Trump is not keen on the big international bodies or the multi-country trade deals. The US now prefers bilaterals to multilaterals, as you heard Mark say. One area where the existing global arrangements are being reviewed, for example, is in climate change. President Trump wants to exit the Paris Agreement. So who better to speak to about his approach to international affairs and climate change than Myron Ebell, who was in the transition team in an environment role. And thanks for joining us. Good to talk to you. There's a huge weight at the moment on trying to understand what the rules of the game are under President Trump. In your view, is that what looks a bit like chaos, is that strategic and planned, or is that just ordinary chaos?
It seems to me that President Trump is trying to get an awful lot done very quickly. So I think the chaos is the result of that. But I think he's moving very rapidly on some major issues.
Yeah. What do you think of that line he heard? We will talk about climate change, by the way, but the line he used about every country in the world is taking advantage of the United States. Now, do you agree with that? Clearly, the US is one of the richest countries in the world, so superficially it's not, you might not think it was the most obvious feature, but do you buy that every country virtually is taking advantage of the US?
I think President Trump is sometimes prone to speak broadly. We'd have to go through each iteration of that. But I think, for example, there has been a long-term problem with NATO, for example, that most of the countries aren't keeping their commitments for defense spending. Right.
So there are examples where the US is more than bearing its own fair share, I suppose. The multilateral bilateral thing. He clearly doesn't like multilateral deals. He's fine with bilateral deals. What can you articulate for us what is wrong with multilateralism and what's better about multiple bilateral than multilateral, if you see what I mean?
You know, I think we would have to again look at these on a case-by-case basis. I think the World Trade Organization, the problem with it is that it hasn't been able to finish any of the big agreements on services for now well over a decade. I mean, it's more like 15 years. So, you know, you can see, I think the multilateral process has sort of come to a, it's frozen up.
Right, and so maybe the bilateral deals will be more successful there. Okay, well, let's move to another really important multilateral area, which is climate change, international agreements. You were not a fan. You were in the transition team as the transitional head of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. Do you think President Trump will pull the United States out of the Paris Agreement and just basically say, guys, we're no longer in it?
President Trump said during the campaign in several speeches, not in off-the-cuff remarks, that he intended to withdraw the United States from the Paris Climate Treaty and to defund the UN climate programs. The principal expenditure is the huge $100 billion a year Green Climate Fund, which is supposed to go into effect in 2020. The U.S. share is $23 billion. He's not alone on this. The Congress will never appropriate that money.
Right. So it seems that that is going to happen. Now, clearly, the rest of the world has, or most of the rest of the world has a different view about what the appropriate action to take on climate change is to the US. Do you think the rest of the world is therefore entitled to say, look, you can put America first, you can do what you want, we're going to stick to Paris, and we'll put, say, a small tariff on American exports because they're not burdened by some of the climate change adjustments that we're all bearing?
Well, I think the rest of the world can talk about that, but it should be recognized that the United States, because of the shale oil and gas revolution, has actually done more to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions than any other country.
Right. I mean, if the US... I suppose what I'm really getting at here is the US is adopting a policy of we're not going to take it anymore. And I'm sort of wondering what happens if the rest of the world says, OK, but we're not going to take it anymore as well, because everybody feels they're a little bit hard done by and everybody's ripping them off. And I suppose I'm just getting at, if that dynamic plays out, where do you, a free market, libertarian type, where do you think that ends up for the world and for President Trump and all his ambitions?
My underlying belief is that the United States, by withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement and defunding UN climate programs, will be turning the world back in the right direction. Another part of the Trump agenda is to make the United States the world's largest energy producer, which will free Europe from the threats from Russian gas and also reduce the influence of OPEC.
Yeah. When do you expect President Trump to actually make an announcement on Paris and how he's progressing on that?
Well, every time I say something, I get misquoted. I think it could happen any time. It could happen tomorrow, or it could happen a month from now, or it could happen later this spring. I don't think it's going to take forever, but I think I have no idea when it might happen.
And can I ask you, I just want to ask you, because you work for a libertarian, a free market think tank. You
Yes.
must disagree with the president's approach to trade, right? You don't believe in slapping up a 20% tax on the border for the Mexican goods, do you? You believe that we've all been enhanced by free trade, don't you? You're completely at odds with the man who you were serving in that transition team, no?
Yes, the Competitive Enterprise Institute is proudly and relentlessly free trade, and that's why I wasn't asked to work on his trade policy.
And are you going to be asked to get a permanent job in the administration?
No, I agreed to work on the transition as a volunteer for about 4.5 months on the condition that I didn't want a job in the federal government.
Myron Ebell, thanks very much. Thanks.
Thank you.